My name is Dr. Julienne Vane, and at 34 years old, I have learned that the most expensive thing you can own is a secret kept by someone who hates you. I am a senior attending neonatologist at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, a position that requires a level of precision where a single cubic centimeter of fluid is the difference between life and a funeral. But to my father, Silas, a man whose soul is composed entirely of real estate holdings and 1960s Macallan Scotch, I was always the expensive mistake. On the night of his Sapphire Gala at the Belvedere Hotel, in a room filled with 400 people wearing more wealth than most small nations produce in a year, he stood at the mahogany podium and toasted my brother, Marcus, for carrying the Vane legacy into the stratosphere. Then he looked directly at me, seated at table 12 in a $2,200 Nordstrom gown I'd stayed up 48 hours straight on a double shift to afford, and told the room that I was the only investment he'd ever made that yielded a 0% return. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the moment the foundation of my life was systematically undermined by a $120,000 lie and a sister who knew exactly where to twist the knife. Growing up in the elite suburbs of Bethesda, Maryland, life was a choreographed performance of old money aesthetics. My sister, Elena, was the prima ballerina. She was 3 years younger and possessed a terrifying talent for weaponizing my father's vanity. While I spent my nights buried in Grey's Anatomy, staining my fingers with highlighter ink and smelling of formaldehyde, Elena was the social butterfly who accompanied Silas to charity auctions and country club luncheons. The hierarchy was solidified during my final year of medical school at Georgetown. I was exhausted, grieving the sudden loss of my mentor, Dr. Eris Thorne, who had been more of a father to me than Silas ever was. Elena saw my vulnerability as an opening. She didn't just tell my parents I was struggling. She crafted a narrative that I had developed a prescription pill dependency, claiming she had found bottles of stolen hospital meds in my bag. She even went as far as to transfer $15,000 from our mother's private account to a Shell Venmo she'd linked to an old email of mine, making it look like I was stealing to fund a lifestyle I didn't have. When Silas found out, he didn't ask for my side. He didn't look at my 4.0 GPA or the letters of recommendation from the dean. He saw a ledger that didn't balance. He cut me off entirely. I remember standing in the driveway of our estate, my belongings packed into a rusted 2012 Honda Civic with a failing alternator, while Silas stood on the portico, his arms crossed over his custom-tailored Brioni suit. He told me I was a disgrace to the Vane name and that from that day forward I was dead to the family. Elena stood behind him, leaning against the pillars of the $8 million mansion, scrolling through her phone with a smirk that still haunts my dreams. I had exactly $312 in my savings account and a mountain of student debt that looked like Everest. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I put the car in gear and drove toward a life they couldn't touch. For 7 years I lived in the trenches of medicine. I survived on lukewarm coffee and 3-hour naps in the on-call room. I became the doctor people call when a newborn weighs less than a loaf of bread and their heart is a fragile, fluttering bird. I bought a modest condo in Canton, drove a silver 2022 Volvo XC60 for its safety ratings, and built a reputation that had nothing to do with my father's portfolio. I never changed my last name. I wanted them to see it on the publications, on the awards, on the hospital wings. I wanted the name Vane to be synonymous with the daughter they threw away. And then the universe decided it was time for a reckoning. It happened on a Tuesday, during a torrential Baltimore rainstorm that turned the inner harbor into a gray, churning mess. My phone buzzed on the sterile metal counter of the NICU. It was a restricted number. It was my mother, her voice a fragile whisper I hadn't heard in nearly a decade, telling me that Silas was in the ICU at St. Jude's, and the doctors were saying he wouldn't make it through the night without a specialist they couldn't secure. They didn't know that the specialist they were begging for was the 0% return, sitting right across the city. My name is Julienne Vane, and I have spent the last 7 years perfecting the art of being invisible while standing in the center of the room. At 34 I am a senior attending neonatologist at Johns Hopkins, but in this dimly lit study in Bethesda, surrounded by the scent of $300 Davidoff Winston Churchill cigars and the oppressive weight of mahogany, I am nothing more than a clerical error in my father's ledger. The $22,400 gold Patek Philippe Nautilus on my brother Trenton's wrist caught the flickering orange light of the fireplace, casting a jagged glint across the manila folder he pushed toward me with the casual indifference of a man ordering a side of fries. "Sign the deed over, Maeve," my father, Alistair, barked, his 64-year-old voice rasping with a lifetime of arrogance and expensive tobacco. He didn't look at me, he looked through me, his eyes fixed on the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler. Your 485-square-foot studio in Portland is an underutilized asset, and Trenton needs the immediate liquidity for a $3.2 million acquisition in the Pearl District. Do it now or don't expect a seat at this table ever again. The ultimatum hung in the air, thick and suffocating like the humidity before a Baltimore storm. Beside him, my sister Felicity adjusted her $1,400 Cartier love bracelet, the gold clicking against the glass of her iPhone 15 Pro Max. She didn't even bother to glance up from her screen, her lips curling into a practiced sneer of upper-class derision. Honestly, Maeve, you look like a gas station attendant in that $45 Columbia parka you insist on wearing, she scoffed, her voice dripping with the kind of venom only a sibling can brew. Just sign the papers and go back to your little typing job so we can finish dinner without having to look at your clearance rack wardrobe. The contrast in that room was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that made the air feel thin. They saw a failure in $60 Levi's and a thermal shirt from a Target end cap, a daughter who had supposedly squandered her potential on a low-level administrative career. They saw a typist who lived in a shoebox. What they didn't see, and what their vanity prevented them from even imagining, was the woman who had spent 70 hours a week for the last decade becoming a senior cryptographic engineer for the Department of Defense. While they played at real estate and social climbing, I was earning a base salary of $214,000 a year, living a Spartan existence on $35,000 while funneling every spare cent into high-yield offshore diversified index funds. I wasn't just a doctor. I was a ghost in the machine of their own destruction. Felicity's curated lifestyle was a house of cards leaning against a hurricane, built on $84,200 of secret credit card debt spread across 6 platinum Amex cards, a financial cancer she had carefully hidden from Alistair's judgmental eyes. Even more delicious was the secret $12.4 million government-funded infrastructure project I had personally authorized to be surreptitiously routed through a shell company that held a long-term easement on the very land Alistair thought he owned outright. I looked at the deed, the cheap ballpoint pen Trenton had tossed onto the table, and then back at the people who shared my blood but none of my soul. I felt a cold, clinical detachment, the same steady pulse I maintained when a newborn's vitals began to flatline in the NICU. They wanted my underutilized asset, to fund a brother who couldn't balance a checkbook without a trust fund safety net. They wanted to humiliate me into submission one last time, unaware that I was the one holding the structural blueprints to their entire reality. I reached for the pen, my fingers steady, my mind already calculating the exact moment I would pull the thread that would cause Felicity's debt to trigger a forensic audit of the family office. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the day I realized that being underestimated was the greatest tactical advantage I could ever possess. It started with a $400 an hour lie and ended with me realizing that family isn't about the name on a deed, but about who holds the power when the lights finally go out. The betrayal didn't arrive with a scream or a grand cinematic gesture. It arrived at exactly 10:42 p.m. during the most suffocating blizzard Maine had witnessed in over 14 years. A night where the 65 miles per hour winds whipped the Atlantic into a frenzy and slammed frozen shards of ice against the $40,000 custom triple-paned bay windows of the estate. The internal temperature of the great room was a curated 22 degrees Celsius, smelling of expensive cedarwood and the lingering smoke of my father's $300 Davidoff cigar. But the air between us had turned to liquid nitrogen the moment I let the word "no" slip past my teeth. Alistair didn't engage in a debate as he was a man who viewed a difference of opinion as a form of structural treason, and instead he simply stood up from his Italian leather armchair with a clinical, terrifying calmness. He walked toward the mudroom with the heavy, deliberate gait of a man who had spent decades crushing competitors in the boardroom, his custom-made mahogany Oxfords clicking against the heated slate tile floors. I watched, paralyzed by the sheer mechanical efficiency of his rejection, as he grabbed my weathered Samsonite suitcase, the one I'd used throughout my residency and my secret government assignments, and marched toward the grand entrance. With a single violent heave, he swung the $14,000 solid oak door open, letting in a swirl of white death that instantly coated the Persian rug in a layer of frost, and threw my entire life into the mounting snowdrifts. Felicity followed him like a jackal trailing a lion, her fingers white-knuckled as she clutched her $12,000 Hermes Birkin bag in Togo leather as if it were a shield against the reality of her own collapsing finances. She didn't offer a sisterly plea or even a look of regret. She stepped forward and shoved me toward the threshold, the strength of her desperation catching me off guard as my boots slipped on the encroaching ice. "The rusted tool shed out back matches your income bracket perfectly, Maeve," she sneered, her voice barely audible over the shriek of the wind, her face contorted into a mask of elitist cruelty that finally stripped away any remaining illusion of family. "Go play house in the dark since you're so fond of your little typist lifestyle and won't help the people who actually matter." The heavy door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in my chest, and the $300 Baldwin solid brass deadbolt clicked into place with a sound that felt like a guillotine dropping. I stood there in the -18 degrees Celsius darkness, the wind chill stripping the heat from my body through my $45 parka in seconds, surrounded by nothing but the howling Maine wilderness and the shadow of the tool shed. But as I looked at the dark silhouette of that shed, I didn't feel the terror they expected. I felt the cold, sharp clarity of a mission finally reaching its activation phase. They thought they were casting me out into a frozen grave, but they had actually shoved me directly toward the epicenter of my own power. That rusted shed wasn't a storage space for lawnmowers and broken rakes. It was the camouflage for a $12.4 million Tier 4 secure data node I had spent 3 years building right under their arrogant noses. As I trudged through the knee-deep snow, my breath coming in ragged plumes of white, I reached into the hidden lining of my sleeve and pulled out a ruggedized encrypted key fob. The blizzard roared around me, a chaotic symphony of white noise, but my mind was already inside the servers, calculating the exact sequence required to freeze the Vane family's liquid assets before the sun rose. They wanted me to live in the dark, but they forgot that I was the one who designed the grid, and in the world of high-stakes cryptography, the person in the cold usually has the clearest view of the fire. Family isn't the warmth of a hearth you're forced to share. It's the light you build for yourself when the people who should have loved you try to turn out the stars. My name is Julianne Vane, and I have spent the last decade proving that the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone assumes is failing. Standing in the knee-deep Maine snow for exactly 90 seconds, I ignored the biting wind chill that sought the gaps in my $45 parka and focused on the rhythmic pulse of my Garmin Tactix 7 AMOLED watch. The digital face glowed with a soft crimson light as it synced with the encrypted satellite overhead, confirming that while my family was inside sipping 50-year-old Highland Park scotch, I was finally stepping into the light of my own creation. I trudged 150 yards through the blinding white squall toward the shack, a structure that to any casual observer appeared to be a crumbling 12-by-12 wooden ruin choked by faux rust panels and rotting cedar shingles. I reached out a gloved hand, brushing away a thick crust of frost from a seemingly not-scarred section of the doorframe to reveal the sleek, obsidian glass of a hidden 4K iris scanner. The device emitted a nearly silent ultrasonic chirp as it mapped my retina, followed by a crisp, synthetic voice that vibrated through the bone of my ear. Identity confirmed. Level 5 security clearance. The floor beneath my boots, reinforced with 8 inches of industrial-grade 40 hardened steel, shuddered almost imperceptibly before descending into the earth with the fluid silence of a high-end elevator. I wasn't a victim seeking shelter from the cold. I was the chief architect of the most secure Tier 4 data monitoring node on the East Coast, a facility buried 40 feet beneath the very soil my father believed was his crowning achievement. As the lift settled into the subterranean hub, the air changed from the scent of freezing pine to the sterile ozone-heavy atmosphere of a server farm running at peak efficiency. Row after row of liquid-cooled racks hummed with a low-frequency thrum, their blue LED status lights blinking like the eyes of a digital god. I walked across the polished anti-static flooring toward the central command console, my footsteps echoing against the soundproofed walls that had been designed to withstand a seismic event. I shed the wet parka, revealing the charcoal tactical gear underneath, and sat before a curved array of 4 32-inch Pro Display XDR monitors that instantly came to life at my touch. With a few keystrokes, I bypassed the standard encryption protocols and opened the forensic audit window I had been cultivating for months. On the left screen, Felicity's secret financial life began to bleed out in high-definition rows of crimson text. $84,200 in delinquent credit card debt, 3 hidden personal loans from predatory private lenders, and a series of forged signatures on the family office's quarterly distributions. On the right, Trenton's so-called $3.2 million acquisition was revealed for what it truly was: a desperate Ponzi scheme designed to cover up his catastrophic losses in the volatile cryptoderivatives market. My father, Alistair, sat at the center of this rot, his entire legacy supported by a foundation of lies and the very daughter he had just thrown into a blizzard. I felt a surge of cold, clinical satisfaction as I initiated the lockdown sequence on the family's primary offshore accounts, effectively turning their millions into useless digital ghosts until I decided otherwise. They had spent years laughing at my little typing job, never suspecting that the keystrokes they heard through the walls were the sounds of their own empire being dismantled bit by bit. Family isn't a safety net or a blood-bound guarantee of loyalty. It is a structural integrity test that the Vanes had just failed with spectacular arrogance. As the blizzard continued to scream above ground, burying the mansion in a tomb of white, I sat in the silent, glowing heart of the machine and prepared to show them exactly what happens when the architect finally stops holding up the ceiling. The truth was about to perform a surgery that no amount of money could fix, and I was the only one in the room with the scalpel. My name is Julianne Vane, and I am the ghost that finally decided to haunt the house that built it. At 34 years old, standing as a senior attending neonatologist and a level 5 cryptographic engineer for the Department of Defense, I have spent my entire adult life being the nothing daughter in a family obsessed with everything. My father, Alistair, once told me that my medical degree was a decorative waste of his tuition money, while my sister Felicity's $12,000 Birkin bag was treated like a holy relic. But as I sat inside the $12.4 million Tier 1 sensitive compartmented information facility buried 40 feet beneath the frozen Maine soil, the power dynamic didn't just shift, it evaporated. The air inside the SEF was a sterile, climate-controlled 20 degrees Celsius, humming with the electric thrum of liquid-cooled servers and smelling faintly of ionized copper and new static-shielded plastic. It was a cathedral of data where my family's lies were finally laid bare under the unyielding glow of a triple-monitor workstation. I opened the file labeled Project Parasite, a digital autopsy of the Vane family legacy that I had been meticulously stitching together for over 3 years. On the high-definition screens, 1,400 pages of encrypted financial logs began to scroll in a waterfall of crimson and white text, revealing a rot so deep it made my father's arrogance look like a joke. At exactly 1:14 a.m., I bypassed the standard encrypted relays and initiated a secure VoIP call to my lead forensic auditor, Elias, whose office in Washington, D.C. I knew smelled of $15 cup artisanal espresso and the cold, metallic scent of impending victory. We spoke in the clipped, efficient shorthand of professionals who deal in ruin, finalizing the digital trail that linked 48 separate fraudulent wire transfers from Alistair's diversified retirement fund directly to Trenton's offshore gambling accounts in the Cayman Islands. The total theft amounted to exactly $1,142,300. A sum that had been bled out in increments designed to dodge the internal alarms of their high-net-worth wealth management firm. As I listened to the rhythmic clicking of my mechanical keyboard, I felt a strange, cold peace settle over me, the same focus I use when resuscitating a 2-pound infant in a level 4 NICU. I wasn't just looking at numbers. I was looking at the price of my own exclusion. Every dollar Trenton had gambled away on high-leverage crypto derivatives was a moment my father had used to call me a failure for only earning a surgeon's salary. I commanded the system to print the final forensic report, the heavy 32 pounds cream-colored watermarked paper sliding out of the high-speed laser printer with a soft, expensive hiss. I tucked the stack of documents into a heavy wax-sealed manila folder, the weight of the paper feeling more substantial than any hug my mother had given me in a decade. Now, let me take you back to the moment I realized that being the family outcast was actually my greatest tactical advantage. While Felicity was busy preening in front of a $4,000 French gilt mirror and Alistair was puffing on $300 Davidoff cigars, they never noticed the girl in the corner with the laptop. They assumed my silence was submission, never dreaming that the typist they mocked was actually the architect of their financial execution. Family isn't a bloodline. It's a social contract, and the Vanes had breached every clause of mine long before they threw me into a blizzard. I walked back toward the subterranean elevator, the manila folder tucked under my arm like a loaded weapon, ready to show them that the daughter they discarded was the only person left who knew how to balance the scales. The truth doesn't just set you free. When applied with surgical precision, It burns everything down to the ground so you can finally see the stars. My name is Julianne Vane, and I have spent my entire life being the silent witness to my family's moral decomposition. A senior attending neonatologist and a level 5 cryptographic engineer who learned long ago that the most powerful weapon is the one your enemy doesn't believe you are capable of wielding. At exactly 2:22 a.m., the oppressive opulence of the Maine Vane estate was abruptly swallowed by the Maine wilderness as I initiated a remote localized grid severance, watching through the crystal-clear 4K thermal feed on my center monitor as the $8 million mansion flickered and died. The blizzard outside continued its relentless assault, but inside my subterranean sanctuary, the air remained a constant, sterile 20 degrees Celsius, smelling of high-end circuitry and the cold satisfaction of a trap finally being sprung. I watched the glowing heat signatures of my brother Trenton and my sister Felicity as they scrambled like panicked rodents through the knee-deep snow, their expensive designer gear offering no protection against a storm they had underestimated just as much as they had underestimated me. Trenton was leading the charge, his thermal silhouette staggered by the weight of a 36-inch forged steel crowbar he had snatched from the garage, his movements dictated by a $4 million panic that I could practically smell through the fiber optic cables. He was laboring under the delusional assumption that this rusted shed housed nothing more than a backup generator he could hijack to stabilize his crumbling servers and finalize an illegal $4.2 million data sale to a foreign shell company, a transaction I had already flagged and intercepted 60 seconds prior. The silence of the bunker was punctuated by the rhythmic metallic thud of the crowbar slamming against the reinforced doorframe above me, the sound echoing through the vent shafts like a hollow death knell for the Vane legacy. I leaned back in my ergonomic Herman Miller chair, my eyes tracking the data packets as they stalled in Trenton's frozen network, while Felicity huddled behind him in a $6,000 Moncler puffer jacket that was rapidly losing the battle against the minus 18 degrees Celsius temperature. She was screaming something into the wind, likely another elitist command for her brother to hurry up, unaware that the door she was trying to breach was backed by 4 inches of ballistic-grade polycarbonate and a magnetic locking system that required a clearance they would never possess. Every strike of that steel bar was a testament to their desperation, a frantic attempt to regain control of a world that had already moved on without them. While Trenton exerted his fading physical strength against the shed, I was performing a far more delicate surgery on their digital lives, my fingers dancing across the backlit mechanical keyboard to finalize the routing of Alistair's remaining liquid assets into a secured escrow account pending a federal audit. I thought back to the countless dinners where Alistair had praised Trenton's business acumen while mocking my small clinical practice, never realizing that his golden boy was a financial parasite who had been bleeding the family dry to fund a high-stakes gambling addiction. Now let me take you back to the realization that family isn't a collection of people who share your blood, but a structure built on the integrity of its foundation, and the Vanes had built their house on shifting sand and stolen promises. I watched the thermal feed as Trenton finally collapsed against the door, the crowbar slipping from his frozen, gloved hands as the realization began to dawn on him that the typist in the shed wasn't just hiding from the storm, but was the storm itself. I didn't feel pity. I felt the cold, sharp clarity of a doctor who has just removed a malignant tumor, knowing that the recovery would be painful but the survival of the truth was finally guaranteed. The blizzard would eventually break, and when the sun rose over the Maine coast, it would reveal a landscape where the only light left burning was the one they had tried so hard to extinguish. My name is Julianne Vane, and I have spent 34 years being the ghost in my family's gilded machine, a senior attending neonatologist and a level 5 cryptographic engineer who learned long ago that the most dangerous weapon is the one your enemy refuses to believe you possess. As I sat within the silent, pressurized sanctuary of the $12.4 million Tier 1 as if buried beneath the frozen Maine shoreline, the air remained a curated 20 degrees Celsius, smelling of ozone and the cold, metallic promise of a reckoning. Above me, the blizzard screamed at 65 miles per hour, but the real storm was focused on the rusted door of my decoy shed where my brother Trenton was currently dismantling his own future with every desperate swing of a 36-inch forged steel crowbar. I leaned back in my ergonomic Herman Miller embody chair, my eyes fixed on the 4K thermal feed that rendered his $4 million panic in shades of frantic neon orange and sickly yellow. I let him strike the reinforced door exactly 6 times, the rhythmic thud of metal against ballistic-grade polycarbonate vibrating through the sensors like a countdown to his extinction. On the seventh strike, just as the steel bar bit into the weather stripping, I reached out and flicked the external defense toggle on my central console. The transition was instantaneous and absolute as four 10,000 lumen industrial LED floodlights cut through the blinding whiteout with the surgical precision of a high-intensity laser, turning the midnight blizzard into a wall of artificial eye-searing day. I watched the monitors as Trenton and Felicity were instantly blinded, their pupils likely shrinking to pinpricks as the sheer magnitude of the light washed out their vision. Before they could even raise a hand to shield their eyes, I activated the long-range acoustic device, LRAD, at a staggering 122 decibels, a frequency designed to induce physical nausea and total disorientation. The synthetic booming voice of the automated security system tore through the wind, vibrating the very marrow in their bones as it announced, "Unauthorized access to Department of Defense asset detected. Lethal force authorized." The sound was a physical wall, and I watched with a cold, clinical detachment as Trenton dropped the crowbar, the heavy steel tool vanishing into the snow as his $2,400 hand-burnished leather Tom Ford boots lost their grip in the freezing slush. He stumbled back, his mouth agape in a silent scream of terror that the microphones couldn't even capture over the roar of the alarm. Felicity, whose entire world was built on the fragile foundation of social standing and $1,400 Cartier bracelets, collapsed to her knees as if her legs had turned to water, her $4,500 shearling coat from Loro Piana soaking up the freezing, muddy runoff of the storm. She looked small, broken, and utterly stripped of the elitist venom she had used to cast me out into the -18 degrees Celsius darkness only hours prior. They thought they were breaking into a tool shed to hijack a generator for an illegal $4.2 million data sale, but they had instead stumbled into a federal hornet's nest that didn't care about their last name or their father's country club memberships. Now let me take you back to the realization that family isn't a biological safety net. It is a structure that requires integrity to stand, and the veins had spent decades rotting from the inside out. While they crawled in the mud, blinded and deafened by the very daughter they called a gas station attendant, I began the final encryption sequence that would lock their personal identities out of every major financial institution in the Western Hemisphere. They wanted me to live in a shack, so I built a fortress, and now the only thing left for them was the cold, hard reality of a world that no longer recognized their currency. The truth doesn't just set you free. It builds a cage for those who tried to bury it, and as I watched them shiver in the spotlight of my making, I realized that the only person truly warm in this blizzard was the one they had left for dead. My name is Julienne Vane, and at 34 years old, I have finally learned that the most expensive thing you can own is a secret kept by someone who no longer fears you. I am a senior attending neonatologist at Johns Hopkins and a level 5 cryptographic engineer for the Department of Defense, a woman who measures life in milligrams and milliseconds, yet to my family I was merely the underperforming daughter who lacked the vision to appreciate their $8 million empire. The public execution began not with a gavel, but with the hum of the subterranean elevator as it rose through 40 feet of frozen Maine earth, delivering me from my $12.4 million Tier 1 SF back into the brutal 65 miles per hour winds of the blizzard. I stepped out of the lift and into the blinding 10,000 lumen floodlights I had deployed, a silhouette of tactical precision in my charcoal gray moisture-wicking gear with my gold and blue federal ID pinned prominently to my chest, a stark contrast to the shivering, ruined figures huddled in the slush. Alistair stumbled into the artificial day, his $900 charcoal silk robe from Bergdorf Goodman flapping pathetically against his legs as he tried to shield his eyes from the glare that had stripped away the darkness he used to hide his family's rot. He looked old, the 64 years of arrogance and $300 cigars finally catching up to him as he realized the typist he had thrown into -18 degrees Celsius darkness was the source of the overwhelming power now pinning him against the storm. I didn't yell or indulge in the histrionics that Felicity so loved. Instead, I moved with the steady, clinical calm of a surgeon approaching an open chest cavity, my footsteps silent on the reinforced steel floor of the shed's entrance. I reached out and handed Alistair the heavy, wax-sealed manila folder, the weight of the 32 pounds watermarked paper feeling like a definitive sentence as his trembling, liver-spotted hands took the folder. "Page 14, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the roar of the wind with the sharpness of a scalpel, not bothering to address the two siblings currently groveling in the freezing mud at my feet. That is the $450,000 Trenton borrowed from your primary retirement fund last Tuesday to cover a margin call on his failing crypto derivatives, I continued, watching as his eyes scanned the forensic audit logs that detailed every fraudulent wire transfer. And page 82 is Felicity's secret Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing, the one she's been hiding while spending $1,400 at a time on Cartier bracelets to maintain the illusion of the golden child you so desperately needed to believe in. Alistair's face, usually the flushed, healthy red of a man who spent his winters in Palm Beach, turned the sickly gray color of ash as the structural integrity of his reality simply disintegrated. The folder slipped from his nerveless fingers, and I watched with a sense of profound, detached justice as the wind caught the 212 pages of their financial crimes, scattering the evidence of their betrayal across the pristine white snow like the debris of a plane crash. As the papers swirled in the 122-decibel scream of the Already alarm, I looked at the man who had traded his daughter for a ledger that never balanced and realized that being underestimated was the greatest gift he had ever given me. Now, let me take you back to the realization that family isn't a biological default. It's a house built on truth, and the Vanes had chosen to live in a mansion of mirrors. While Felicity wailed in her ruined shearling coat and Trenton stared at the crowbar that could never break the encryption of his own greed, I turned back toward the warmth of the technology they couldn't understand. I had performed the surgery, the malignancy was removed, and as the blizzard continued to bury their house of cards, I finally understood that the only way to truly belong to yourself is to stop trying to belong to people who only value you when you're quiet. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the floodlights finally come on. My name is Julienne Vane, and at 34 years old, I have finally learned that the most expensive thing you can own is a secret kept by someone who no longer fears you. I am a senior attending neonatologist at Johns Hopkins and a level 5 cryptographic engineer for the Department of Defense. A woman who measures life in milligrams and milliseconds, yet to my family I was merely the underperforming daughter who lacked the vision to appreciate their $8 million empire. The climax of my family's moral decomposition didn't happen behind closed doors or in a hushed boardroom. It happened at exactly 2:45 a.m. under the blinding glare of 10,000 lumen floodlights and the rhythmic, terrifying shriek of federal sirens. 3 black-armored 2024 Chevrolet Suburban High Country editions screeched up the winding, ice-slick driveway of our main estate, their tires churning through the knee-deep snow and throwing plumes of freezing slush into the air. I stood on the reinforced steel platform of my hidden data node, the cold Atlantic wind whipping my charcoal tactical gear, and watched as the world my father built on vanity and theft finally imploded. The scene was a chaotic masterpiece of high-stakes consequences as FBI agents in heavy tactical vests swarmed the mudroom entrance, their boots thudding against the frozen earth with a sound like rolling thunder. They didn't care about the $22,000 gold Patek Philippe Nautilus on my brother Trenton's wrist or the prestige of the Vane name. They cared about the 99% complete encrypted transmissions still pulsing on his high-end Alienware laptop. I watched with a clinical, detached satisfaction as 2 agents tackled Trenton into the freezing mud, his face contorting in a mask of primal terror as his $4 million panic finally met the hard reality of federal law. He was being arrested for federal wire fraud and corporate espionage, a direct result of the encrypted logs I had spent 3 years meticulously cataloging from within my subterranean sanctuary. Beside him, my sister Felicity was being detained as a primary accessory, her $4,500 Loro Piana shearling coat now ruined and caked in the dark, icy filth of the driveway. Her high-pitched screams for our father were muffled by the howling 65-mile-per-hour winds, becoming nothing more than background noise to the systematic dismantling of her curated, fraudulent life. Alistair stood by the grand oak doors, his $900 silk robe soaked through with sleet, looking like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own legacy as the agents hauled his golden children toward the idling Suburbans. He looked at me, standing there with my federal ID pinned to my chest and the weight of the truth in my hands, and for the first time in 34 years he didn't see a failure or a typist. He saw the architect of his own destruction, the daughter he had thrown into the blizzard who had returned to burn his house down with the light of 1,000 suns. Now, let me take you back to the realization that family isn't a biological default. It's a structure built on the integrity of its foundation, and the Vanes had built their house on shifting sand and stolen promises. I watched the taillights of the armored vehicles fade into the whiteout of the storm, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than the blizzard itself. I had performed the surgery, the malignancy was removed, and as I turned back toward the warmth of the technology they couldn't understand, I finally understood that the only way to truly belong to yourself is to stop trying to belong to people who only value you when you're quiet. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth finally comes out and the sirens go silent. I walked back into the elevator, the doors closing on the wreckage of my past, ready to build something that didn't require a lie to survive. My name is Julianne Vane, and I have spent my entire life being the silent witness to my family's moral decomposition. A senior attending neonatologist and a level 5 cryptographic engineer who learned long ago that the most powerful weapon is the one your enemy refuses to believe you possess. The fallout of that frozen night in Maine was not a gradual decline but a total, catastrophic collapse of the Vane legacy. A structural failure that began the moment the first black armored Chevrolet Suburban screeched away from the estate. I watched the legal system dismantle my brother with the same clinical precision I used to debride a wound. And the sentencing was a surgical strike that left no room for the expensive legal maneuvering Alistair had relied on for decades. Trenton, the golden boy who once wore a $22,400 Patek Philippe as a badge of unearned superiority, was sentenced to 22 years in the United States disciplinary barracks at Leavenworth without the possibility of parole, his future now measured in the gray dimensions of a federal cell rather than the square footage of Manhattan penthouses. The investigation revealed that his $3.2 million acquisition in the Pearl District was never about real estate development. It was a sophisticated front for a multi-state money laundering operation that had been bleeding Alistair's diversified holdings dry for years. Because the crimes involved the systematic evasion of federal statutes, the IRS moved in with a ferocity that even Alistair's $600 an hour tax attorneys couldn't bluntingly deflect. They didn't just freeze the accounts. They initiated a total seizure of every tangible asset Alistair owned to cover $1.4 million in back taxes, interest and civil penalties that had accumulated like a terminal illness behind the scenes. I stood on the periphery of the chaos, watching from my silver 2022 Volvo XC60 as agents in windbreakers marked IRE began the process of inventorying the very estate I had been kicked out of only weeks prior. It was a moment of profound cosmic irony to see the man who had dragged my suitcase into a blizzard being handed a federal eviction notice by a woman carrying a government-issued clipboard. Alistair was being kicked out of his home by the same federal government that paid my salary, his $900 silk robes and $300 Davidoff cigars replaced by the cold, bureaucratic reality of a forfeiture proceeding. The main estate, with its $40,000 custom bay windows and heated slate floors, was no longer a monument to vain excellence but a line item in a government auction catalog meant to satisfy a debt that pride could no longer pay. Felicity, stripped of her $1,400 Cartier bracelets and her social standing, was forced into a humiliating plea deal that left her with a permanent felony record and a life of hourly wages she had once mocked me for earning. As I drove away from the wreckage, the sound of my Michelin tires on the gravel felt like the final period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. Now, let me take you back to the realization that family isn't a collection of assets or a biological default. It is a contract of mutual respect that the Vanes had breached long ago. They thought they could discard me like an underutilized asset, never realizing that I was the one holding the structural blueprints to their entire reality. I didn't feel the triumph I expected, only a deep, quiet sense of closure as I returned to the NICU to care for patients who actually understood what it meant to fight for a future. The truth doesn't just set you free. It clears the ground so you can finally build something that isn't dependent on a lie to stay standing. Family isn't blood. Family is the people who don't need a folder of crimes to know who you are. And as the sun rose over the Atlantic, I realized I was finally home. My name is Julianne Vane, and I have learned that the most expensive luxury in the world is not a diamond-encrusted watch or a beachfront estate, but the cold, silent ability to say nothing when your enemies finally begin to drown in the shallow water of their own making. At 34, as a senior attending neonatologist and a level 5 cryptographic engineer, I deal in the absolute physics of survival, a world where a single misplaced decimal point or a missed heartbeat is the difference between a future and a memory. 2 weeks after the black armored Chevy Suburbans tore through the Maine slush to dismantle the Vane legacy, the silence of my life was finally broken at exactly 4 a.m. by the clinical ping of an encrypted notification on my workstation. I was sitting in my minimalist Canton condo, the air smelling of freshly ground dark roast coffee and the ozone of my idling servers, when an email materialized from a blocked IP address associated with a $20 track phone burner purchased at a CVS in a dilapidated suburb of Scranton. The message was from Felicity, though the digital signature was a frantic, ungrammatical mess that bore no resemblance to the woman who once spent $1,400 on a Cartier bracelet without blinking. She was writing from a 600-square-foot basement apartment with peeling linoleum floors and a persistent smell of damp concrete, a space she now shared with Alistair, the man who once viewed the world as a private country club. The email detailed a reality that was a mathematical insult to their former lives. Felicity was now working 45 hours a week at a commercial laundromat for exactly $13.50 an hour, her manicured hands now raw from industrial bleach and the heat of $4,000 dryers she could never hope to own. She begged for a wire transfer of $5,000 to get back on her feet, a sum that wouldn't have covered the monthly detailing bill for Trenton's seized Tesla, yet now represented a monumental fortune to a woman whose credit score had plummeted into the low 400s following her secret bankruptcy. I sat there for several minutes, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off my medical badge, feeling a profound sense of detached symmetry as I looked at her desperate prose. I didn't feel the surge of anger I expected. Instead, I felt the calm, steady pulse of a surgeon finishing a successful operation. I moved my cursor with a precision that comes from years of high-stakes procedures, attaching a single PDF file to my reply. It wasn't a bank statement or a letter of pity. It was a high-resolution screenshot of the text message she had sent me during the blizzard, the one where she told me I belonged in a rusted tool shed because it matched my income bracket perfectly. I typed no greeting and offered no signature. I simply hit send, watching the data packets travel back through the digital ether to her basement purgatory. I then initiated a permanent IP-level block on the domain and deleted the encrypted account I had used to monitor their downfall, effectively erasing the Vane family from my digital and physical horizon. Now, let me take you back to the realization that family isn't a biological default or a blood-bound guarantee of loyalty. It is a structural choice that requires a foundation of truth to survive the storm. While Alistair and Felicity struggled to breathe in a world that finally required them to earn their keep, I returned to my rounds at Johns Hopkins, where the only things that matter are the lives we save and the integrity we keep when no one is watching. The truth doesn't just set you free. It constructs a boundary that no amount of inherited wealth can breach, and as I walked back into the sterile light of the NICU, I realized that the only person who had truly transitioned from the darkness was the daughter they had left for dead. Family isn't blood. Family is the quiet strength of knowing that you owe nothing to the people who only valued you when you were invisible. My name is Julianne Vane, and I have finally come to understand that the most expensive luxury in the world is not a diamond-encrusted watch or a beachfront estate, but the cold, silent ability to say absolutely nothing when your enemies begin to drown in the shallow water of their own making. At 34 years old, serving as a senior attending neonatologist at Johns Hopkins and a Level 5 cryptographic engineer for the Department of Defense, I deal in the absolute physics of survival, a world where a single misplaced decimal point or a missed heartbeat is the difference between a future and a memory. 2 weeks after the black-armored 2024 Chevrolet Suburban High Country editions tore through the Maine slush to dismantle the Vane legacy, the silence of my life was finally broken at exactly 4 a.m. by the clinical, rhythmic ping of an encrypted notification on my workstation. I was sitting in my minimalist Canton condo, the air smelling of freshly ground dark roast coffee and the ozone of my idling servers, when an email materialized from a blocked IP address associated with a $20 track phone burner purchased at a CVS in a dilapidated suburb of Scranton, Pennsylvania. The message was from Felicity, though the digital signature was a frantic, ungrammatical mess that bore no resemblance to the woman who once spent $1,400 on a Cartier love bracelet without blinking an eye. She was writing from a cramped 600-square-foot basement apartment with peeling linoleum floors and a persistent damp smell of concrete, a space she now shared with Alistair, the man who once viewed the entire world as his private country club. The email detailed a reality that was a mathematical insult to their former lives. Felicity was now working 45 hours a week at a commercial laundromat for exactly $13.50 an hour, her manicured hands now raw from industrial bleach and the heat of machines she could never hope to own. She begged for a wire transfer of $5,000 to get back on her feet, a sum that wouldn't have covered the monthly detailing bill for Trenton's seized Tesla, yet now represented a monumental fortune to a woman whose credit score had plummeted into the low 400s following her secret bankruptcy filing. I sat there for several minutes, the blue light of the 32-inch Pro Display X-Dur reflecting off my medical badge, feeling a profound sense of detached symmetry as I looked at her desperate prose. I didn't feel the surge of anger I expected. Instead, I felt the calm, steady pulse of a surgeon finishing a successful operation where the patient was finally free of a terminal malignancy. I moved my cursor with a precision that comes from years of high-stakes procedures, attaching a single PDF file to my reply. It wasn't a bank statement or a letter of pity. It was a high-resolution screenshot of the text message she had sent me during the blizzard, the one where she told me I belonged in a rusted tool shed because it matched my income bracket perfectly. I typed no greeting and offered no signature. I simply hit send, watching the data packets travel back through the digital ether to her basement purgatory. Today, I sit in my new 3,200 square foot penthouse in Boston, overlooking a city that doesn't care about my father's name or my brother's crimes. The only sound is the quiet, expensive hum of my Jura Z10 espresso machine and the whistle of the wind against the triple-paned reinforced glass. But this time I am the one holding the keys to every door in my life. I have realized that family isn't a biological default or a blood-bound guarantee of loyalty. It is a structural choice built on integrity, and I owe the Vanes nothing but the truth they tried so hard to hide. I walked back toward the window, the morning sun hitting the glass and reflecting a future that I built with my own hands, realizing that the only way to truly belong to yourself is to stop trying to belong to people who only value you when you are quiet. Family isn't blood. Family is the people who stay when the truth finally comes out and the sirens go silent. And as I watched the city wake up below me, I realized I was finally, irrevocably home.